Hi everybody, welcome to this series that we're making about the way that the different terrains of consciousness are responding to the current coronavirus situation happening in the world. And we thought that today we'd start with talking about the order-based terrain, square. For those of you who don't know much about the 10 terrains of consciousness, the order-based terrain square is primarily organized around feeling safe in the face of chaos using the strategy of order. And order means civilization, laws, authority, coming together as a collective. How does our society run smoothly for the common good and the safety of all? So what we're really seeing in this situation at the moment is the operation of the system to keep the majority, to keep the masses safe.
And we're really seeing this happening on a global level, not just a nation-based level. Everybody is following a planned script, if you will, from the World Health Organization on down through various government agencies. Once this organizing governing body has made an edict, then everybody has followed that across the world, starting in China. Now we have an entire planet following this lead.
In Square, generally, there needs to be a buy-in to a consensus reality. Like all the conspiracy theories and everything that people are seeing flashing around on Facebook, they're not really coming from people at Square. They tend to come from Pyramid or Diamond. Square is very much, we all agree on a particular truth for the sake of the common good. Once a consensus has been come to as a collective, and the consensus here is there is a scary, dangerous, contagious virus going around the world, which we need to protect ourselves against. Now, whether you happen to agree with that or not, whether you've got your own theories about that, it's 5G or it's aliens or whatever you think, right now we're talking about Square. And at Square, the consensus reality is that there is a contagious virus on the loose that is dangerous for people's health and that could spread. And that's the consensus reality that's been agreed on. So all the legislative actions, all the social actions, all the choices people are making at that terrain are based on this commonly shared belief that has been agreed upon in order to deal with the current situation.
And it's even interesting that the government didn't just have one prime minister or one person make the rule. They in order to get the Square collective to buy in, they at the very beginning were quite stated in the fact that they had teams of doctors and teams of administrators around the country all collaborating and discussing. They stated this quite often: we didn't arrive at this lightly because we have had so much consultation from the medical and from the various other administrators, state level and other authorities at various positions, that the people could then say, well, okay, this has been arrived at in a democratic process. And that's an important one to look at, because Square relies on the will of the majority in a democratic sense of consensus. And so this consensus had to be created in the minds of the collective for them to then say, yes, okay, we'll all follow this rule if that's what you tell us is in our best interest. Had it had just come down from, say, the president or the prime minister
or a king,
or a king, and just said, you're all going to do this because I think it's best, there would have been a huge reaction. So there's quite an interesting buy-in that has to happen with Square in a democratic mind sense. I don't want to quite go to the point of control of the mind, but it almost could border on that, because you have to get the Square population to accept something that's going to impinge on their freedoms and their liberties, because that's what they fought long and hard to wrest away from the past history of pyramid that was more of tyrannical dictatorships oftentimes. And so there is a DNA in the Square psyche against a dictatorial directive. So it had to be done in a way that was perceived as democratically arrived at rather than dictatorially enforced.
That's really true. And I think that it's also important to explain that at Square, there's a very interesting relationship with authority and rules that we don't find at the other 9 terrains. At Square, there is a willingness to follow authority and to follow rules, but only if those rules are perceived to be fair, and only if those rules are perceived to be being enforced and enacted in a responsible and competent way. It's not just following any old stupid rule, but if they perceive that the rule is fair and it's well administered and it's competent and it's been, legally arrived at, then people at Square will follow rules or follow authority because it gives them a sense of safety and stability, because there's a deep unconscious belief that the safety is coming from the smooth running of the system. And there's a perception that for a system to run smoothly, it has to have consistent and fair rules. And because there's a belief that we need consistent and fair rules, there's also a willingness to accept punishment for the breach of those rules, so long as the punishment is administered fairly. So someone at Square will willingly follow rules, they'll willingly go to jail if they believe they have genuinely disobeyed those rules, and they will also monitor their neighbours, their community, their family to check that everyone else is in order. So you don't even really need a police state at Square, although obviously the shadow of Square can lead to a police state. But in a just healthy running Square society, people will self-monitor, they'll follow the rules, and they'll monitor their neighbours with shaming or with, hey guys, step into line, stop hanging out at the beach, you're supposed to be in isolation. And people at other terrains don't understand this because they don't have the same relationship to authority and safety that you find at the order-based terrain.
It's an institutional terrain. Primarily, the institutions are held in the medical institution, the legal institution. They're worried about overwhelming the medical system. In the government's response to this, they do mention protecting the elderly, and they do mention protecting those that will be more at risk. But that's even sort of less emphasized. The greater emphasis and the direct emphasis that I have seen again and again is that we do not want to overwhelm our health system. That's why we need to flatten this curve, as they're calling it. We need to slow the spread down by isolating, by slowing the contact of people to people, so that we keep this from becoming this raging pandemic that will sicken a huge swath of the population in days' time, which would then flood our health system to the point of breaking. So they're really looking more at management of the institutions and management of the system, and managing that ability to be within its carrying capacity for the collective, rather than the actual individuals, where you would probably find at a diamond terrain or other terrains, their emphasis would be more about the concern of the individual.
Well, people at Square are very concerned about the individuals, they're very concerned about their family, they're concerned about the vulnerable members of society. I hear a lot of that when I talk to my friends at Square. But I do hear what you're saying, because core to the psyche at Square, like the survival strategy at Square, is that we will survive the chaotic natural world and the chaotic wild west of pyramid and the chaos of individualism. We will survive that by coming together as an ordered, civilized society with a smoothly running system. And it's kind of a social contract. It's been written about for centuries. The social contract that people make to allow themselves to be governed, preferably by a smoothly running system. So one of the big fears at Square is if that system stops being able to run smoothly, that's going to lead to chaos, and we'll be back at the Wild West, and it'll be every man for himself, and how will we all survive? So if you understand that the deep fear and need for safety of someone at Square is the need for order, and the kind of order that we're talking about is the order of a smoothly running system. That's why when we designed the icon of Square, we've got this square and we've got this little guy at the dot at the bottom, and he's looking up at the edifice of the system all around him, which is keeping him safe. It's the house, it's the family, it's the university, it's the government, it's the smoothly ordered running of society.
And it is this idea about order out of chaos and order from chaos. So as Tahnee mentions, it's the order-based terrain. It is looking to keep things in the bounds of this box, because if they get out of bounds, then you have chaos. And we had to wrest chaos to get them inbound and institutionalized so that we could all function collectively. And we are not going to, at Square, allow the water to break the dam, if you will, or overrun the banks, to then have the valley flooded and everything washed away. So it's a management system that is looking to keep everything orderly and in bounds.
I feel like one of the most important things to convey is that someone who's at the order-based terrain Square is really coming from a selfless state. At the previous terrain pyramid, the wool-based terrain, it's very much every man for himself. How can I survive? That's not what's happening at Square. So you really need to understand that what's driving this is actually care, a care and concern for the well-being of all, particularly for the well-being of the majority. So there's a real focus on the common good. And when you look at what's happening on social media and on the news, people are willingly giving up their own individual freedoms and rights to protect everybody. So it's like, let's all stay at home and keep our society safe. So it's really important to understand that this is actually coming from a place of care and honor. People at Square feel that it is honorable to stay home and self-isolate in order to protect the majority from the spread of what they perceive to be a dangerous virus that could actually damage the collective safety of the entire society. So it's really important to understand that.
And it's also important to understand the idea that as the government of this country we're in at this moment, Australia, has pointed out, each person needs to play their part and do their piece. And if everybody steps up and does the piece they need to play, then the whole thing will work collectively. So there is this mantra of individual responsibility to the collective whole. And it's interesting because there's also a commercial jingle that I often hear on television programs for the insurance industry in this part of the world, where they say we're all in this together. And that's kind of been picked up in this time, and it's being repeated now by the news media and just people on the street. You know, so it's a kind of a mantra, we're all in this together.
Well, that's
so
the ethos of Square.
And that really is the ethos of Square. It's basically that we collectively work as one unit, and as a unit working to isolate ourselves from each other and to follow the directives that the government has prescribed for the whole, then we will get through this very quickly and be able to move on.
And you need to understand that that terrain, the order-based terrain Square, has arisen in response to the previous terrain, the wool-based terrain pyramid, which is very much a Wild West mentality where it's every man for himself. Who's got the quickest gun wins. You know, so it's a kind of Wild West mentality. And Square is in reaction to that. So if you think of the response of mainstream people to people who are hoarding toilet paper, or people who are just going out and hanging out on the beaches and don't care about spreading the virus, you see that very ancient and deeply held fear that Square has of the chaos of pyramid. And so we're really seeing this playing out, this sense of let's all come together and act responsibly as a collective for the common good of all. And you'll see this throughout history in wars, particularly wars where a nation comes together to fight a perceived enemy, and people will give up their rights. You know, they'll willingly, go without food. They'll huddle in the bomb shelters. They'll send their firstborn off to the war for the sake of the society, for the sake of the country. We're very much seeing that mentality happening now, especially most strongly in those countries where there's a prevailing terrain at Square, like where we live here in Australia. The majority, the prevailing terrain here is at Square, so people have very easily slipped into this, we're all going to be responsible for the sake of the community mentality. That's not the case in every country. There's other countries where the prevailing terrain is at Diamond, and we'll talk about that in other videos.
So if we look at the terrains in a continuum, we see that the pyramid terrain is an individual terrain, individually focused, and the diamond terrain is also. The collective terrain of Square, though, is in between those, feeling a bit of anger towards those at Diamond that are asserting themselves individually, shaming them even, and there's a lot of guilt and shame that's being used in the undertone amongst neighbors. And that's how you get everybody back into order, is to shame on you for not doing what we all should be doing together.
And I was just thinking while you're talking that there's another element here that we haven't addressed, which is really, I guess, you could call it the absolutism of Square, and it really comes out in times of crisis. It's a kind of black and white thinking. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a survival strategy of right and wrong. And so you see it when a nation is at war. The way that we can justify sending our firstborn sons and our children to go and fight is we believe that we're in the right and the enemy's in the wrong. And you can see this kind of right and wrong, black and white mentality coming out at the moment with the virus. The virus is the enemy. It's kind of like the war on drugs. This is the war on the virus. And there's very much black and white thinking happening at the moment, and not so much questioning. We are starting to see some questioning in the media from Square journalists, which has been really interesting to see, but it tends to be more about the fairness of what's been enacted legislatively, consequences to the system, for consequences to the economy. So it's still very much square questions and square criticisms that are being drawn by these journalists, but it's still all very much within that same black and white thinking that the virus is bad and we all have to come together to fight it.
And there is a interesting point that a journalist made that I was listening to last night, who's been following medical pandemics for decades now. And he really addressed the point which I hadn't really considered, but this is actually why this is happening. He mentions how we have an addiction to the need to have, one cause for the disease. In other words, this virus is causing this pandemic rather than a myriad and a plethora of things happening that could involve 5G, that could involve pollution in highly polluted areas, that could involve people at all different points of immune health and or lack thereof, all having various effects. But the tendency is to always want to find one culprit and then attack that one culprit as the enemy. So Square always tends to, as history has shown, as wars have shown, identify an enemy, a black and white, as Tahnee mentions, reason to mobilize. Whereas at other terrains, we have many different possible answers for why things are happening the way they're happening. At Square, we're really seeing that we need to identify one culprit. In all of the various events facing humanity, global warming and oceans rising and a long list of resource issues, people feel like they don't really have a way to grasp it. But when you can isolate a virus and say that's what we need to focus on, then you can now marshal and corral the collective terrain of Square to follow an edict. So it actually becomes a very empowered way for Square to feel like it can actually wrest control against an unsafe environment. It's why there's been such a response in the world to pounce on this virus. Now they feel like, we've got finally something that we can all marshal, like a Marshall Plan. We can all marshal our resources around and focus on so that we can actually feel like we're being effective. We can feel we're being productive. We can feel we're actually getting somewhere.
Yeah, I really feel that Square as a terrain comes into its own in crisis situations where we can all rally together to overcome a common enemy. I mean, you think about it like in sci-fi shows I've watched where, there's an oxygen leak on the ship and suddenly everyone's operating together as a slickly oiled machine to get the ship ready so it will survive. It's the same kind of thing, whereas I've heard people saying, but no one's been so upset about all the children starving from hunger and famine over the last 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. And suddenly, because there's a few elderly people getting sick or rallying, that's because hunger is not a simple thing that we can all just isolate ourselves and take collective action to fix. And so when there's something where the perception is there's an enemy, we can take simple action collectively and we can have a collective impact, it's where Square will step up and be incredibly honourable and incredibly selfless, and really Square comes into its own. And the other thing that was coming to mind to me when you were speaking was how the difference between pyramid us versus them mentality and Square let's all band together to fight a common enemy mentality is that pyramid, it's very much every man for himself. So if this was playing out in a pyramid society and there was a perceived virus that was contagious that could kill everyone, people would just be holing up in their houses, like hoarding all the food. There'd be no helping your neighbor. There'd be no let's all sing out the window to each other. There'd be no let's all connect on social media. It would just be, I'm looking after my household and my family and everyone else could get stuffed, basically. Whereas at Square, yes, there's a common enemy, but it's a common enemy. It's not just me against everybody. It's all of us against one enemy. So at Pyramid, it's me against everybody. I'm worried about all the other people in the horde. They're all going to come get me. I've got to, keep myself safe, have the quickest gun, amass the most wealth. In the case of a virus, I've got to stock up on food and make sure my family's safe. At Square, it's the exact opposite. All of us are going to come together to defeat a single enemy. And so it's where the nation state really comes in. And that's why we're seeing a lot of stuff happening around borders. It's not like we're looking down at the earth as a collective village and we're coming up with plans for the global earth in this crisis. Everybody's protecting their own nation. We're closing the borders. No more ships can land. No more airplanes can land. States are now controlling their borders so people from other states can't come into their particular state. So it's not me and my family against everyone else, but it's us as a state or as a nation coming together to protect our borders from the virus.
Well, it's an idea that borders define order. In fact, if you take the B off of border, you've got order. It's in the psychology, it's in the psyche of order to be able to bound that which could be boundless. And if it's boundless, you can't order it. But if you can bound it, then you can order it.
And that's basically the square. So I feel like that's a good place to wrap this up. We've given you a brief introductory summary of the order-based terrain square and how people at this terrain are responding to the coronavirus situation and what's playing out globally in regards to this terrain. We're going to make a couple of other videos about Square, one going into really the challenges and fears that this is bringing up for people at Square, this situation. And we're going to do another video on the inspiring perspective of Square and things that you could say to someone at Square that would really uplift them and encourage them at this time. So we really hope you enjoyed this one.
Thank you.